All right. So far we've been talking about primarily skeletal muscle. But there are two other types of muscle, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And while they both share some traits in common with skeletal muscle, they also kind of have some differences as well. And so right now I'm going to talk about the first of those two, cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle shares some traits in common with skeletal muscle, particularly with the slow oxidative fibers of skeletal muscle. When you think about it, your heart is the ultimate endurance muscle. It has to work every day, all the time, for your entire life, and it never gets to rest. Your heart can't ever get tired. Your heart can't ever get fatigued. If it ever just stops to take a rest for a few minutes, you die. And in order to do that, it's basically, metabolically speaking, it's kind of like slow oxidative muscle, but even further off the track. Like everything that's true about smooth muscle is slow oxidative fibers. Everything that's true about slow oxidative fibers is even more true about cardiac muscle. So slow oxidative fibers have slower twitches. Well, cardiac muscle has even slower twitches than that, 10 to 15 times longer contractions than skeletal muscle. And slow oxidative fibers are endurance muscle. Well, the heart is the ultimate endurance muscle. Slow oxidative fibers have lots of mitochondria, and they're very, heavily supplied with blood through capillaries. Cardiac muscle has a ton of capillaries, and it actually gets blood fresh off the pump. Literally fresh off the pump. It is the pump, and when oxygenated blood that has the most oxygen, comes back to the heart from the lungs, as soon as it leaves the heart, the first thing that it does is feed the heart. So it is the blood that has the most oxygen to give the fastest. And cardiac muscle has even more mitochondria than slow oxidative fibers do, and the mitochondria that it has are even bigger than they are in slow oxidative fibers. So it is like the darkest of the dark meat. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle both share some traits as well, and in this case, they are both autorhythmic. That means that they're not under voluntary control. Your heart beats without you thinking about it. Your stomach digests without you thinking about it. But more than that, it means that they can undergo a contraction without being stimulated by a nerve. Now, cardiac muscle is more autorhythmic than smooth muscle, or at least it's more pronounced autorhythmic. If you take cardiac muscle and just like cardiac muscle fibers and put them in a petri dish, they'll contract to the beat of their own drum. So the heart doesn't actually need any nerves to cause it to contract, and it will contract regularly to its own beat. There are nerves that go to the heart, and they can tell the heart to speed up or slow down, sort of like they can twist the volume knob from like a 2 to an 8, but they don't ever turn it off. Smooth muscle is also autorhythmic, or at least some smooth muscle is autorhythmic, but most of the time it is under the control of the nervous system. So most of the time when smooth muscle contracts, it's contracting because it's being stimulated by a nerve to do so. There are some smooth muscles that do contract in response to a particular non-nerve signal, particularly stretch, but most of the time there's a nerve telling them to do it. However, they also have some differences as well. So cardiac muscle is, like we said, it's super, super oxidative. It's super, super slow oxidative muscle. Well, smooth muscle is often the other direction. Smooth muscle actually doesn't have any mitochondria, and it doesn't generate ATP very fast, and the only way that it does generate ATP is through anaerobic respiration, glycolysis. It's not very fast twitch. It's actually very, very slow in terms of its twitch length, but it does get all of its energy from anaerobic sources. Both cardiac and smooth muscle are myocytes. So if you remember earlier when we talked about muscle fibers, we said that a muscle fiber is kind of like a muscle cell in that it's all one unit. It's surrounded by a cell membrane called the sarcolemma, but it's a really weird muscle cell because it's like they can be like 30 centimeters long, and they've got multiple nuclei running down them, and they're actually formed by the fusion of a bunch of cells called myoblasts that go together. So they're not, often thought of as a true cell. They're kind of like a cell conglomerate. But cardiac and smooth muscle are both cells, and so myocytes means muscle cell. Myo means muscle, cyte means cell. They're not long fibers. Cardiac muscle cells are sort of fibrous, but they're limited in length. They're not super long, and they have one nuclei. Same with smooth muscle cells. Smooth muscle cells are fusiform, meaning they look kind of like a toothpick, and they also are single cells with a single nuclei. Both cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary, and they both receive innervations from the autonomic nervous system. That means the automatic or subconscious nervous system, rather than from the somatic nervous system, which controls skeletal muscle and voluntary control. Cardiac muscle contracts, like I said, with a regular rhythm. It works all the time without fail and without conscious attention. In fact, it's very difficult to control in any sort of conscious way. It's highly fatigue resistant. The muscle cells of the chamber contract in unison, or actually nearly in unison. The signal starts from a part of the heart called the pacemaker, and it proceeds in two directions, and so actually the bottom of the heart contracts first, and that sort of squeezes the blood up, but one signal propagates through all of the heart. So it isn't like each particular myofiber of the heart has its own nerve running to it. And they also aren't each contracting to the beat of their own drum. They have to all follow the same beat. And that's because there are special cells called the pacemaker in cardiac muscle, and they set the beat, and everyone follows that beat. And the signal propagates from one cell to the next cell, to the next cell, to the next cell, to the next cell. And it does that because the cells are joined together with the special area called the intercalated disk. The intercalated disk is sort of where two cardiac muscle cells butt end to end, and it can actually look like it's just one muscle cell continuing, but there's this disk that separates them, and the disk actually separates them into two different cells and it looks like a thick dark line. But those two cells are linked, and they're linked by gap junctions. If you recall way back to the early lectures, gap junctions are cell-cell junctions that have little holes in them. Those holes allow some things to move from cell to cell. Specifically, the ions that control the action potential can move from one cell to the next, so that the action potential can spread from one cell to the next cell. They also have mechanical junctions, particularly desmosomes, to keep the intercalated discs from pulling apart. Cardiac muscle, unlike skeletal muscle, doesn't have a fully developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. It does have some sarcoplasmic reticulum, and when an action potential propagates down it, it will release some calcium internally. But the heart actually requires external calcium in order to work. So some of the calcium that's going to cause it to contract is actually coming in from outside of the cell. If you recall from back when we were talking about bones, we talked about how hypocalcemia can have cardiac problems, like it causes heart failure. One of the reasons why it would cause cardiac problems, while not necessarily causing skeletal muscle problems, is because skeletal muscles keep their own supply of calcium, whereas cardiac muscles are relying on calcium from the extracellular fluid. Cardiac muscle cells also never get truly repaired. They never regenerate. They can die, and when they do die, that's called myocardial infarction or a heart attack, or at least myocardial infarctions and heart attacks can cause them to die. And since you can't just sit there with a hole in your heart, that wouldn't work. The dead tissue has to be plugged up very, very quickly. And it's plugged up quickly by fibrosis, which is the generation of scar tissue. So if you have a heart attack or heart damage, scar tissue forms there very quickly, but that scar tissue is not muscle tissue, and it's non-contractile. The more scar tissue that builds up in your heart, the less function your heart has. Your autonomic nervous system, that's, remember, your subconscious or automatic nervous system, can tell your heart to increase or decrease. Basically, you have a nerve that hooks into your to your pacemaker, and that nerve, when it stimulates the pacemaker, it causes the pacemaker to slow down or to speed up, depending upon the type of stimulation that it gets. But it can't ever turn it off, and shouldn't ever need to turn it back on. In fact, if your heart does stop for some reason, it can't turn it back on. The heart muscle has really slow twitches, even compared to SO muscle. The heart is very slow, and it maintains tension for a long period of time, 200 to 250 milliseconds. This is because it takes time to squeeze the blood out of the heart. Cardiac muscle can be 25% mitochondria by volume. So they have a huge amount of mitochondria, and like I said, it gets the most oxygenated blood the fastest, and it has large stores of glycogen. But even then, it will take sugar out of the blood when you have high blood sugar and store that for glycogen use, because it just can't run out of energy. So here we can see some of the general features of cardiac muscle fiber. These are cardiac muscle fibers right here. You can see that these dark lines here, and they're sort of done up in light blue here. Those are the intercalated discs. That's where one fiber, one cell joins into another. And you can see that cardiac muscle fibers are actually branched. So you can see these branches going there and there. You can see some branches highlighted here. There are several reasons for that, but basically what it does is it allows, if one cell is stimulated, it could stimulate multiple other cells through its branches. So it allows the signal to be amplified. Each of these fibers has its own nuclei in it, because they're all myocytes. And up here you can see some glycogen granules as well. So that's pretty much what I have to tell you about the heart here. This will be continued talking about smooth muscle in just a moment.